Did you know that in the 5th Scream movie, Amber and Richie's killer motive is based on a very specific Stephen King villain? Keep watching to find out exactly which one it is and why, as well as to find out every other horror movie reference that can be found in Scream 2022. What is up, Scream team? Zach Cherry here, and in my continuing series of uncovering both the hidden and obvious references to past horror movies within the Scream franchise, we'll be going over all 39 horror movies referenced in last year's long-awaited reboot, which will also include every instance in which a callback or homage was made to the previous 4 Screams. So we'll go ahead and preemptively add those to the chart now. But before we begin, make sure to hit that subscribe button with those bell notifications turned on, toss this video a thumbs up, and let me know in the comments down below any horror movie references in Scream 5 you think I might have missed. Let's get into it. The movie starts off as we're introduced to Tara Carpenter, who while home alone receives a phone call from a mysterious voice who eventually reveals to her that they want to play a game. This opening scene template has obviously been a franchise cliche that was used in Screams 1 and 4, with a variation of it in Scream 3 as well, but it was notably absent in Scream 2's opening, where the characters instead attended a premiere of Stab, the movie which Scream's events are based on. As far as the original concept is concerned, however, the phone call element dates back as far as 1974 with Black Christmas, and then again in 1978 with the made-for-TV movie entitled Are You in the House Alone?, which in a generational coincidence features Richie Kirsch actor's real-life father, Dennis Quaid, as a perpetrator who stalks a young woman, routinely making harassing phone calls, like father like son. But for the sake of keeping the chart less cluttered, I'll credit the phone call trope's main source of inspiration to 1979's When a Stranger Calls, in which a babysitter receives numerous harassing phone calls from a killer who, unbeknownst to her, is already inside the house. The mysterious caller also claims their name to be Charlie, a reference to one half of Scream 4's Ghostface killer duo, Charlie Walker, and upon asking Tara what her favorite scary movie is, she responds with The Babadook, a 2014 Australian supernatural horror film in which a widowed mother and her troubled son are haunted by a strange children's book which mysteriously manifests itself inside their home. Tara goes on to classify this as elevated horror, a term which is used to describe art house cinema that focuses on emotional and dramatic elements rather than blood, guts, and jump scares. Other contemporary titles that fall under this subgenre are It Follows, Hereditary, and The Witch, all of which are directly referenced by Tara as well, as being among the horror movies she's most knowledgeable about. However, the voice on the phone in this case seems to be more interested in the Stab franchise, and shows us this directly after Tara hangs up on them, as she receives a text message from someone who she believed was her friend Amber Freeman, telling her to pick up the landline when it starts ringing again. This plays out almost identically to the opening scene of the fictional Stab 6, as shown to us in Scream 4, where Trudy receives a message from her stalker, insisting that she and Sherry answer the ringing telephone. In Tara's case, however, this segues into her discovery that Amber's life may be in danger, and is prompted to answer a series of questions in order to prevent her friend from being killed. Very much the same as Casey with Steve in the original Scream, a truncated version of this with Cotton and Christine in Scream 3, and then also with Kirby and Charlie in Scream 4. However, while each one of them was unwillingly forced into their respective scenarios, Charlie was only pretending to play the helpless victim, which, as we retroactively discover later on when she's revealed to be the killer, is also the same case when it comes to Amber's involvement. As Tara starts to play the caller's game, the first question asked of her is to name the Woodsboro native who went on to be the heroine of the Stab franchise. Despite claiming to not know that much about it, however, she not only correctly guesses Sidney Prescott, but also volunteers additional information by stating that Sidney lived on Elm Street. Although this scene was cut down in the 1996 movie, Kevin Williamson's draft of the script included a shot of Sidney on her computer, sending the police her address as 34 Elm Street. The street sign can also be seen later on as Sam and Richie drive into Woodsboro, but this is also a major reference to 1984's A Nightmare on Elm Street, featuring the iconic dream slasher Freddy Krueger, who was the creation of previous Scream franchise director Wes Craven. The caller disregards Tara's answer, claiming it to be a warm-up question, which anyone could have gotten, stating further that the character of Sidney Prescott appeared in 7 of the 8 current Stab movies, and I would be remiss to not point out the factual continuity error here, as we know from dialogue spoken in Scream 4 that Sidney was only featured in the first 3 Stab movies. biographies. You can refer to this video right over here to get more insight into the logistics and legalities behind it, but this is the first instance within the Scream franchise where the Stab continuity directly conflicts with itself. At the very least, if you don't believe me, look up personality rights and how they work, because there's no feasible way that Sidney Prescott would be a character in any of those later Stab sequels. The Stab continuity isn't all messed up, however, as after asking Tara to name the actress who played Casey Becker, Tara looks up a cast listing on her phone where it correctly shows Heather Graham in the role. Heather originally appeared in these Stab scenes in Scream 2 and then again in Scream 4, but we're also reminded of other cast members who have been established in additional scenes, including Tori Spelling as Sidney Prescott and Luke Wilson as Billy Loomis, as well as David Schwimmer as Dewey Riley, who was never physically seen but referenced several times throughout Screams 2 and 3. We also see a credit for the fictional actress Jennifer Jolie, who had appeared as herself, played by Parker Posey in Scream 3. And then we get a plethora of new cast information as it's discovered that Vince Vaughn played Stu Macher, Alicia Silverstone played Tatum Riley, Craig Bierko played Cotton Weary, and Ron Howard played Principal Arthur Hembury. There's also a credit for another real-life actor, Christopher Speed as Randy Meeks, who according to Randy in Scream 2 was an unknown actor whose only credit at the time was playing a stagecoach driver in an episode of Dr. Quinn Medicine Woman. As this isn't factually true to real life, since Christopher Speed didn't receive his first acting credit until 2012, it can be reasoned that Speed is playing a fictionalized version of himself that existed long before the present day events. He does turn up later on for newly filmed Stab footage within the Scream canon, but it's also worth noting that Robert Rodriguez once again receives director credit for the movie after having his name shown in front of the film during the Stabathon in Scream 4. His name never appeared during the credits when we first saw the movie within a movie during the premiere that was attended by Phil and Maureen, but it's widely been misconstrued that Rodriguez filmed the Stab footage as he was credited as a second unit director on Scream 2. In actuality, Wes Craven filmed all the original Stab footage, and Rodriguez's name was just added in as a joke years later. However, there is another continuity error as the film is listed as being a 1997 release. Of course, this is an excusable mistake as Scream 2 did come out that year. However, it is established that the events are taking place 2 years after the 1996 Woodsboro murders, which would place the original Stab release in 1998, despite a Scream 2 continuity error where the movie theater's marquee incorrectly lists the year as 1997. Technically, as the events of Scream 1 are taking place in September of 1996, Sidney and Randy would still be in their senior year at Woodsboro High, so we should know that the date in question isn't accurate. Going back to Tara, the caller then tricks her by asking who the killer was in the original Stab, but omitting any pluralization that would denote the involvement of a second killer. Tara of course takes this literally to mean the answer only contains one killer, naming them to be Billy Loomis, but quickly realizing her mistake as the caller informs her that the correct answer included both Billy Loomis and Stu Macher. This is again a callback to the opening of the first film where Casey Becker gives an incorrect answer regarding the naming of the killer in Friday the 13th, as she proclaims it to be Jason Voorhees, when in actuality his mother Mrs. Voorhees was the killer, with Jason not making his homicidal debut until the sequel. This is also slightly echoed in Scream 4, when the caller gives Kirby a multiple choice question regarding the first horror movie that went on to start the slasher craze. However, they neglect to include none of the above as one of the options, leading Kirby to fall for the trap. But as Charlie is obviously one of the two killers, Kirby is given a pass and allowed to answer one more question. Tara, however, is not, which prompts her to grab a kitchen knife and run for the front door, where she directly bumps into Ghostface, who was waiting there for her. This acts as a slight subversion of a scene in the original Scream, where Sidney similarly goes running out the front door, but instead comes face to face with Dewey, who was holding up the Ghostface mask. This particular beat also features Sidney trying to escape from Billy, a killer who she had rightly suspected as being the killer, while the updated version here features Tara trying to come to the rescue of Amber, a killer who she had wrongly assumed was a victim. This once again segues into a similar composition to the original film's opening, as Tara slowly backs away from the front door of the house, just as we had seen with Casey. However, the ensuing violence is more akin to Scream 4, as we see Ghostface lunge out at Tara from a darkened doorway, just as they did with Jill, and then identically to Olivia getting a defensive offensive stab wound through the hand, the same beat is once again repeated here with Tara. Finally, the opening scene culminates in a shot of Ghostface standing over their victim as they deliver a final blow that literally slices into the film's title card, which is an opening scene capper that was used twice already in Screams 3 and 4. The title of the movie itself, simply just the reuse of Scream without any numerical denotation, is obviously a marketing strategy to increase box office revenue by introducing the film to new generations who might be turned off by the idea of having to invest time in catching up with multiple sequels. We've seen this a lot over the years, as practically every new Texas Chainsaw Massacre movie is given some variation of the title Texas Chainsaw Massacre. However, as we'll see this figure into the meta commentary later on, this is most likely a reference to 2018's Halloween, which acted as both a sequel and a reboot, commonly referred to by its portmanteau Requel, to the long-standing Halloween franchise, in which it's actually the 11th entry. After the title card, we're introduced to Tara's older sister, Sam Carpenter, and if the name Carpenter sounds familiar, that's because it's an obvious homage to horror director John Carpenter. However, a little later we'll discover that Sam is the illegitimate daughter of deceased Ghostface killer Billy Loomis, which could very well give her name the variation of Sam Loomis, which was not only the name of a character featured in Alfred Hitchcock's 1960 classic Psycho, but is perhaps most notably remembered as being the name of Michael Myers' psychiatrist, famously portrayed by Donald Pleasance, who made his debut in the original Halloween from 1978, which incidentally happened to be directed by none other than John Carpenter. So I'll go ahead and add both of those movies to the chart. Speaking of other famous names, Wes Hicks, who we find out is the son of Deputy Judy from Scream 4, is commemoratively named after director Wes Craven. And if you'll remember back to Scream 1, when Tatum asked Sydney who she thought would play her in a movie about her life, Dewey said that he could see her as a young Meg Ryan, which oddly manifested itself into this film, as actor Jack Quaid, who plays Richie Kirsch, is the real-life son of the actress, quite literally making him a young Meg Ryan himself, or at least a subversion of the idea. Also, similar to the original Scream, Richie mirrors Billy in the fact that they're both the boyfriend characters who are introduced alongside the film's lead, only for each one to later on be revealed as the killer. In the next scene, where we're introduced to the film's younger cast, this of course acts as this generation's water fountain scene, which saw a different variation in each subsequent film, except for Scream 4. There was one filmed, which shows up as a deleted scene on the Blu-ray special features, but this of course mostly resembles the original, for the fact that it begins with Woodsboro High's principal making an announcement over the school's speakers. However, as a bonus Easter egg, the new principal is voiced by none other than Drew Barrymore, whose murder as Casey Becker in Scream 1 was the topic of conversation during that initial scene. Later on during Sam and Richie's drive to Woodsboro, she explains to him how most of the Stab movies are based on things that happened in her hometown, specifically mentioning Billy Loomis and his friend, obviously Stu Macher, and even referencing the year 2011 as the last time a real-life Ghostface murder spree had occurred, which would have been the events that took place in Scream 4. However, as we know during that movie that there were already 7 Stab films produced, and based on current dialogue telling us that only one more had been made since, which has nothing to do with the previous entries, it lets us know that Scream 4 was never adapted into a movie, meaning that the first Stab was the only one to depict actual real-life events that took place in Woodsboro. That doesn't present a fallacy in Sam's statement, however, as it's still very possible that Stabs 4 through 8 could have been set in this location, but there's certainly a lot of contradictions here that are hard to ignore. We get another reference to the original Halloween when Richie compares the Ghostface visage to Michael Myers' signature white mask. However, further dialogue pokes fun at the fact that the premise of Stab, or Scream in this case, bears a lot of similarities to John Carpenter's classic. Of course, as we all know, Scream stands on its own as the movie that redefined the slasher genre, but it's also a well-known fact that the original movie's writer, Kevin Williamson, wrote the screenplay after largely being fascinated by Halloween growing up. We then get a reference to Friday the 13th, which presents an issue for the chart, as Richie jokes about the killer having seen the 1980 original and using Jason Voorhees as a source of inspiration. As I had already mentioned earlier with the callback to Scream 1, we know that Jason didn't become the franchise's killer until the sequel, where he then went on to be the featured heavy in 10 of the 12 franchise entries, including Freddy vs. versus Jason. So I could technically add all of those movies here if Ritchie is referring to the franchise as a whole, but considering that he's putting on the pretense of not being a fan of horror movies, I think the writers are intentionally referencing Casey's slip-up of omitting the fact that Mrs. Voorhees was the original killer. Therefore, I'm just going to include the first movie to once again keep things more streamlined. When Sam and Ritchie arrive in Woodsboro, we learn that she has a past connection to most of the younger characters, as she used to be a teenage babysitter for them. This may just be coincidental, but it's a similarity that Sam shares with legendary final girl Laurie Strode, who is portrayed by Jamie Lee Curtis in Halloween. We also find out that Sam and Tara's mother, Christina Carpenter, is currently out of town on business, which is a piece of information that regards her somewhat as an updated version of Neil Prescott. This is pretty standard for the Scream franchise, however, as most of the teens have been shown to be latchkey kids, both past and present, but there's an added parallel between Sam and Sydney's story, as both women are left to process the life and death of their other parental figure. In Sydney's case, it was her mother Maureen, and for Sam, it's Billy Loomis, as they're even haunted by dreams or hallucinations of them at varying points throughout the franchise. In an even more obscure connection, Sam left Woodsboro when she was 18 years old, which is around the same age that Maureen was when she had done the same thing as discovered in Scream 3. Similarly, it's revealed that both women had disappeared for several years without any communication, which could suggest that future Scream installments might see something from Sam's missing years coming back to upturn her life. We then get another Halloween reference when Chad calls Vince an uglier Michael Myers, and the scene transitions out into the parking lot where we hear the song Red Right Hand playing on Vince's car stereo. The song, which was initially introduced in the first movie, made an appearance in the two subsequent entries, but was conspicuously absent from 2011's Scream 4. Speaking of Vince, whose time on screen was criminally cut short, he acts as sort of a human canvas of Easter eggs. When you examine his tattoos, you'll find references to Jason Voorhees, and again, while that doesn't specifically narrow it down to one movie in the franchise, I think I'll give a reference spot to Friday the 13th Part 3, released in 1982, as not only was that the sequel that debuted the infamous hockey mask, but as shown here by its condition and inclusion of all the red chevrons, most closely resembles his appearance in that movie. Further down, we also have a reference to Freddy Krueger, albeit in cartoon duck form with his burnt face and brown fedora, which in an even more interesting connection, Kyle Gallner, who portrays Vince, also played the updated version of Johnny Depp's character in the 2010 remake. Vince even has the numbers 1428 tattooed on his knuckles, which represents the address of the Elm Street house, originally lived in by heroine Nancy Thompson. There's also a tattoo reference of Wes Craven's Shocker, a 1989 supernatural slasher in which a serial killer sentenced to death by way of chair is resurrected through electricity in order to get revenge on the man who turned him in. Vince also has an X-cross design with the letters WC and numbers 72. A bit more obscure, but this is most likely a reference to Wes Craven's directorial debut, with 1972's The Last House on the Left, where a husband and wife exact revenge on a gang of psychopaths who murdered their teenage daughter before taking refuge in their home. Finally, there's also a tattoo of a skull with a single red chevron on it that's been impaled by a Buck 120 hunting knife, which, as we all know, is Ghostface's signature weapon. But we can also see the name Leslie wrapped around it, which figures into the plot later on when we find out that Vince's mother Leslie is the sister of former Ghostface killer Stu Mocker, making Vince Stu's biological nephew. Vince's killer even wipes their blade here in the same manner that was first performed by Stu back in the original Scream. In the next scene, where we see Sam's first hallucination of Billy Loomis, the production team has intentionally dressed her in a white t-shirt and pair of blue jeans, which just so happens to be the exact same outfit that Billy died in. This is nothing new for the franchise though, as wardrobes have been used in the past to reveal what roles certain characters will play. For instance, we're about to find out that Sam is Billy's daughter, so it makes sense that we would receive this visual parallel. But as we notice later on in the movie, Ritchie is the one wearing blue plaid, just as Billy had, as well as Jill in Scream 4. However, the killer wears blue plaid theory is not actually 100% accurate, as Derek, who was not a killer, also wore blue plaid during his scenes at the Delta Lambda party in Scream 2. Speaking of symbolic connections to Billy, if you recall back to his pre-codal conversation with Sydney during the party in the original movie, he made a reference to 1991's Silence of the Lambs, comparing Sydney's trauma to that of Jodie Foster's character, who incidentally was having visions of her dead father. This statement is made all the more ironic, considering that it became a prophecy for him that has now come full circle. So regardless of whether this was intentional by the writers, I'm still going to add this to the chart for how serendipitous it turned out to be. As far as whose footsteps Sam is technically following in, however, the movie continues the tradition of having our heroine receive the welcoming phone call from the killer, with them even giving us a brand new take on Hello Sydney.
Hello, Samantha.
With that said, this particular call mostly echoes the one from Scream 2, as Ghostface remarks on what a pleasure it will be to come for Sam, right before surprising her from behind the door. Moving ahead a few scenes, we're reintroduced to Dewey Riley, who seems to have had a fall from grace since we last saw him. Right off the bat, however, we're given a reference to Tatum Riley when we notice a memorial of which presumably includes her ashes. There is another subtle nod to Tatum's death, as it can be reasoned that Dewey's decision to help Sam is predicated on the fact that he didn't want the same thing that happened to Tatum to happen to Sam's younger sister as well. It's also mentioned specifically that Tara was stabbed 7 times, which may be a reference to the opening scene of Scream 2, where we discover later on from Mickey that Jada Pinkett's character had also been stabbed the same number of times. When Dewey invites Sam and Richie into his trailer, there's a reference to Gail's questionable hairstyles, as she can be heard talking about her bangs from Scream 3 while her show is being broadcast over the television. Dewey then goes on to recite Randy's 3 rules of surviving a horror movie, yet he puts his own unique spin on it. Rule number 1 states never trust the love interest. This is obviously a reference to Billy in relation to Sydney, and Stu in relation to Tatum, and potentially a reference to Charlie in relation to Kirby, as well as Jill if we are looking at her as the love interest to Trevor in Scream 4. But outside of those names, this rule doesn't hold much weight, since more often than not, the love interest isn't the killer, as Dewey himself was a love interest to Gail. Rule number 2 states that the killer's motive is always connected to something in the past. This is true for the Loomis family killers in the first 2 movies, and then Roman in Scream 3, but obviously does not apply to the killers in Scream 4, as their motive was technically more forward-thinking. And finally, rule number 3 states that the first victim always has a friend group that the killer is a part of. This again is extremely tenuous, as Casey, Steve, Maureen, Phil, Jenny, and Marnie did not appear to be directly part of any friend group in their respective movies. As for Cotton in Scream 3, you could build a case that he was a cast member of the new Stab movie, where Roman appeared to be killing off the characters in the order they die in the script. However, Casey did sit next to Sydney in English and had a previous relationship with Stu, but for this being the most important rule, as stated by Dewey, this one does feel a little bit contrived. After Sam and Richie leave, we're reintroduced to Sydney when Dewey calls her, where we discover that she's since gotten married to and had several children with a man named Mark. Although this is unconfirmed, it's most likely that Mark is Detective Kincaid from Scream 3, which left off on a very ambiguous note in regards to their future and relationship. We can also see from Dewey's phone that he has Judy as one of his contacts. This is most likely alluding to Judy Hicks, who is now the sheriff of Woodsboro, as the two shared a friendship in Scream 4, which appears to have carried on years later, as there was even a deleted scene in which she tried to recruit him back onto the force. We then get a reference back to Scream 2, as the song Brothers by Hans Zimmer starts to cue up when Dewey arrives to assist Sam in her investigation. This spaghetti western inspired arrangement has acted as Dewey's unofficial theme song throughout the years since, but was actually music borrowed directly from the score of the movie Broken Arrow. It's also in this scene where we find out that Chad and Mindy are the niece and nephew of Randy Meeks, with their mother Martha Meeks making a reappearance after last being seen in Scream 3, where she delivered the videotapes of the trio on the Sunrise Studios backlot. The living room is decorated as a memorial to Randy, so naturally this scene will include most of the references to other horror movies. First up, we see a photo of a movie theater marquee with the already mentioned Nightmare on Elm Street and Last House on the left, but there's also a third Wes Craven movie listed with 1977's The Hills Have Eyes, in which a family driving through the Nevada desert in their RV are targeted by a savage group of cannibals. We also see movie posters for the already mentioned Psycho, as well as The Blob and Vertigo, both from 1958, as well as 1956's Invasion of the Body Snatchers, and The Skull, which was released in 1965. So I'll go ahead and add all of those movies to the chart. Speaking of posters, I mentioned in my previous horror movie reference videos how the original Scream's key art design was an homage to Silence of the the Lambs, with Scream 2's art homaging both Malice and Wolf, which would then later be homaged by Bride of Chucky. But when it comes to Scream 2022's poster art, this particular design appears to be an almost exact composition of the key art for 1995's Halloween: The Curse of Michael Myers. It's a pretty basic design, so there's no telling if this was intentional or not, but even though Curse is the 6th entry in the Halloween franchise, it's the 5th Halloween movie to feature the story of Michael Myers. So based on the visual similarities and the numerical correlation alone, I think that's enough to warrant a spot on the chart. Speaking of key art designs, the alternative cast poster for the movie featuring everyone's face appears to be another compositional homage, only in this case to Star Wars: The Last Jedi, which incidentally was directed by Rian Johnson, who, as we find out in this scene, was also the director of the fictional Stab reboot. Mindy even references the new Star Wars movies, along with the already mentioned Halloween 2018, as well as the new Saw, which can only be referring to 2021's Spiral, which is a reboot of the franchise that sees Chris Rock play a detective who investigates a series of gruesome murders that resemble the past works of the Jigsaw Killer. Mindy goes on to say how requels/legacy-quels are the new winning formula, blasting the more recent remakes of Flatliners, Child's Play, and Black Christmas as being part of an outdated trend in horror that long overstayed its welcome. Amber also mentions the name Jordan Peele, and although there's no specific reference to his 2 movies at the time, Get Out and Us, the dialogue makes sure to give space to the director as he's quickly becoming one of the most influential figures in the modern horror genre. It's also suggested by Mindy that the killer is dissatisfied by Rian Johnson's Stab reboot and is making their own version of the movie, where they're targeting new main characters who are supported by and related to the legacy characters. Sam, obviously related to Billy, with Tara related by association, Vince related to Stu, Wes related to Judy, and Dewey is a returning character, but also related to original victim Tatum Riley. Liv, whose last name is Mackenzie, could possibly be related to the neighbors of the Beckers, as referenced by Casey's parents in the original, but Amber Freeman and Richie Kirsch have no familial relationship to anyone from the past movies, which makes sense later on after we've discovered that they are the killers. This next one might be more of a coincidence, but when Sam almost gets into an accident while distracted by yet another Billy hallucination, the scene is very reminiscent of Kirby driving in Scream 4, where after Olivia references Final Destination, we're reminded that just like in that franchise, death is not too far off for the characters in Scream. In the next scene, depicting the murders of Judy and Wes Hicks, we're first treated to a plethora of Wes Craven related references on Judy's phone, where we're shown the contacts of Tina G and Nancy T. Tina Gray was a character from the original Nightmare on Elm Street, played by Amanda Wyss, who was the best friend of the aforementioned final girl Nancy Thompson, played by Heather Langenkamp in the 1st, 3rd, and 7th franchise installments, all of which were either written and or directed by Wes Craven. Additionally, Leroy and B. Adams are references to Craven's 1991 film The People Under the Stairs, in which an attempted burglary goes awry when an inner city family discovers that their landlords are hiding something sinister in their basement. Leroy, played by Ving Rhames, was the name of one of the burglars, and B. Adams is a reference to Brandon Quinton Adams, the actor who played the 13-year-old main character, Fool. When the killer threatens to murder Wes, prompting Judy to race home in an effort to save him, we're reminded of the opening scene of Scream 3, in which Cotton had also raced home after discovering that the killer was watching his girlfriend while she was in the shower. This scene mostly plays out the same, however, it's subverted by the fact that Judy is killed first, and before she can make it inside the house, where Cotton was instead taken out second. The killer also directly name-drops Psycho, referencing the infamous shower scene from the movie that features Janet Leigh, where the scene then segues into a replication of the shot underneath the shower head, which was also featured in the opening scene of the first Stab movie. We also get a reference to Judy's lemon squares, which was a running gag throughout Scream 4, in which Gail mocked the deputy for her veiled attempts to ingratiate herself to her husband through baked goods, which in Gail's words,
tastes like ass.
We're also shown that the bad blood between the two women may have never dissipated, as after Gail shows up to report on the murders, she makes an off-the-cuff confession to Sam that she and Judy didn't like each other. However, in another major plot subversion, we find out during Gail and Dewey's brief reunion that he was the one who left her. Previously in Scream 3, it was revealed that after trying to make things work in Woodsboro, Gail left Dewey in order to focus on her career and an upcoming gig on 60 Minutes 2. In Scream 4, she obviously conceded committed to allowing him to have his career as the sheriff while she disappeared in his shadow as the small town housewife, but it would appear that in the time between films, Dewey wasn't as supportive when it was her turn to be presented with an opportunity. When Sam calls Richie, we're given even more references back to the Stab franchise. When Dead Meat, who in this universe is called Film Fails, calls out the new movie for just naming itself Stab, rather than Stab 8. This of course brings up the Halloween 2018 argument again, but more importantly is probably the single most meta thing this movie has to say about itself. Richie hammers this point home even further when he declares to Sam that the franchise goes off the rails with the 5th installment, obviously taking into account that this is the 5th Scream, but also acting as a reference to Jenny and Marnie's conversation in the last movie, where she claims that Stab 5, which is all about time travel, is by far the worst film of the franchise. Richie's computer screen also references Kirby in an Easter egg that shows us that she is in fact still alive after being stabbed by Charlie at the end of Scream 4. And if you also notice in a deleted scene from earlier at the police station, she appears in an artist's sketch on the wall where she's mysteriously labeled as a missing person. There's also another video link on Richie's screen hypothesizing the idea that Stu Macher could still be alive, which in an even crazier correlation, Stu's portrayer Matthew Lillard provides the voice of the Chrome Face Killer, who appears on screen running around with a flamethrower in the newest Stab entry.
That shit is lit.
When we next visit Tara in the hospital, she's watching an episode of Dawson's Creek called The Scare, which was written by Scream creator Kevin Williamson and had an original air date of May 5th, 1998. The episode itself is somewhat of an homage to Scream, as it contains many allusions to the franchise, but more importantly, it starred Joshua Jackson, who played the film class student who argued with Randy over the aliens quote in Scream 2, and also featured a guest appearance by Scott Foley, who more famously played Sidney's long-lost brother and Scream 3 killer Roman Bridger, making him the second former Ghostface actor to physically appear on screen in this movie. Afterwards, when Tara gets out of her bed to investigate the strange noise in the empty hospital wing, the power is shut off and she's left to pull herself down the creepy corridor. Although this is a bit of a stretch, this scene appears strikingly similar to 1981's Halloween 2, in which an injured Laurie Strode is taken to Haddonfield Memorial Hospital, where medical staff and security guards are picked off by Michael Myers until she's the only one left to wander the hallways. As Tara goes to hide in one of the rooms, Richie arrives and is hit on the head with a phone. Although this moment is more similar to how Randy was hit in the face with a phone by Gail outside of her van, Richie's reaction is more so a reference to the dialogue between the killers after Billy aggressively uses the phone to strike Stu during the climax of the original movie.
Leave me with the phone, Dick!
Immediately after this, Richie is attacked by Ghostface, where they slice his arm almost identically to Jill in Scream 4, obviously done as a strategic play to misdirect suspicion away from them. A similar scenario played out in Scream 2 with Derek, although in his case it occurred off screen and wasn't staged for anyone's benefit. Considering he turned out to be innocent, it is rather ironic that out of the 3 characters, his injury was the only one to ever be called into question. We then get a callback to Scream 3, where Dewey once again forgets to shoot the killer in the head, but upon remembering Randy's rules and Sidney's instructions, he goes back to finish the job. Unfortunately, it's too little too late, and in a reference to the video game Call of Duty, Dewey is killed by Ghostface in the exact same fashion as one of their finishing moves as a playable operator. Later on, after Sidney arrives in Woodsboro, she meets Sam for the first time, who is now more interested in getting out of town rather than swapping war stories. Sidney mentions how she also tried running once, which can only be a reference to her time in hiding during the interim between Screams 2 and 3. After this, we discover that the teens are throwing a memorial party at Amber's house to commemorate Wes, where even though it isn't made entirely known to us just yet, we should obviously be able to tell by the layout that we're looking at the same location of the Mocker farmhouse from the conclusion of the original. Incidentally, the location was planned to make a reappearance in Scream 4, where it would have been revealed that Kirby's family now lived there, but for production reasons, this was never able to happen. It's also in this scene where it becomes plainly clear why Dylan Minette's character was named Wes, as this acts as a not so subtle way to honor late director Wes Craven. It's during Chad's toast where we also get voice cameos from former Scream actors like Henry Winkler, Adam Brody, Hayden Panettiere, Jamie Kennedy, Drew Barrymore, and even Matthew Lillard, who can also be heard separately, as his is the voice of the party guest, who ironically compliments Amber on having a cool house. Up next, Amber leaves the party to get more beer, in a callback to Tatum's big scene in the original. However, it's mostly subverted here by a jump scare instead, as well as the fact that rather than going into the garage, the beer is now stored in the basement, a room which we never saw before, but is presumably where Billy and Stu kept Neil Prescott tied up. The jump scare with Mindy behind the fridge is also a callback to the Stab franchise, as Robbie in Scream 4 mentioned the well-worn cliche of a refrigerator door closing to reveal a harmless character standing behind it. When we check back in with Sydney and Gale, there's a callback to Gale's first publication, Wrongly Accused, which was based on the murder of Maureen Prescott. Gale proclaims that none of the current murders would be happening if she had never written that book, and although this may be an oversight or just very specific dialogue, Sydney fails to mention that her half-brother Roman Bridger was actually the one who started this all, as she instead credits the Stab legacy to Billy. To be fair though, they are speaking in the context of the Ghostface killer, and Billy was the first one to wear the costume, so I don't see this so much as a continuity error, as much as a direct reference to the Stab phenomenon. Back at the party, we finally get to see the newly canonized Stab footage, which, depicting the scene of Randy explaining the rules, mimics the original scene almost verbatim, right down to Stab Randy and everybody else's wardrobe. Following this, Chad leaves the house with a giant candlestick to look for Liv, where if you listen carefully, a party guest can be heard referring to Chad as Colonel Mustard, obviously a reference to Clue, the popular board game from Parker Brothers, which was later adapted into a movie in 1985, where the idea of a mansion with secret passageways was already referenced in the franchise once before with Scream 3. Chad then uses an app on his phone to track Liv's location in a scene which closely resembles a famous set piece from the 1979 sci-fi horror film Alien. The scene in question features a character searching the spaceship's air duct system in order to force the film's titular villain into the airlock. While this goes down, the rest of his team tracks his movement over a monitor where an unknown entity suddenly appears closing in on his location, only to reveal the monster standing right behind him. We then get another individual voice cameo while everyone is clearing out of the party, although this time it's Jamie Kennedy, who can be heard as the guest who's standing over Mindy and her date. Ironically, this puts Randy's spiritual self behind the couch for a change, which soon segues into a recreation of his famous scene from the original, where this time the killer sneaks up behind Mindy, which in a meta twist is the very scene equivalent that she's presently watching in Stab. After the killer attacks her and Sam and everyone else comes running into the room, we see several VHS tapes sitting on the shelf behind her, which, other than the already referenced People Under the Stairs, also includes Joyride. Released in 2001, the film follows two brothers and their friend on a cross-country road trip, where they incur the wrath of a psychopathic truck driver after playing an innocent prank using an old CB radio. This scene also depicts several characters startling each other as they abruptly run into the room after being conspicuously absent, which in itself acts as a callback to Scream 3, where a similar event played out at Jennifer's house directly after the attack on Stephen Stone. It's here where Amber then reveals herself to the group as being one of the killers in a very similar fashion to Billy revealing himself in the original. This causes Sam and Richie to flee into the basement, where in an attempt at trying to convince her that Tara is still a suspect, he proclaims that there are always two killers, which even by Stab franchise continuity is probably not right, considering that Roman would have still been the only killer in Stab 3. When Sydney and Gale arrive at the house, Amber running outside and feigning a stab wound is reminiscent to the first movie, in which Randy and Stu approach Sydney at the front door claiming the other to be the killer. In both cases, the characters rightly determine the scenario to be a trap. However, this time it's Amber who stands alone in Sydney's original position, while Sydney and Gale now stand in for Randy and Stu. It's here where Amber shoots at the two, hitting Gale in the exact same spot in the ribs where she was shot by Mickey in the climax of Scream 2, and although it's become a reoccurring theme for Gale to sit out most of the finales while Sydney does all of the heavy lifting, it's slightly subverted here when Gale is brought back inside the house later on. As Sydney enters the house, the first spot she goes looking for Amber is in the foyer closet, where she had originally hid from Billy with her father in the original. However, this also demonstrates Sidney's ability to think just like the killers, as this was something established to us in Scream 3, with her mindfulness to go into battle against Roman, also wearing a bulletproof vest. After this, when Richie is revealed as the killer, the setup slightly echoes Charlie's reveal in Scream 4, as both instances involve a seemingly innocent love interest who unexpectedly stabs their girlfriend in the gut during a premature victory celebration. Richie also echoes Charlie again, as the dialogue exchange between him and Sam is identical to a line spoken twice in Scream 4, once in a deleted scene and then again during his phone call to Sydney.
This isn't a fucking movie.
It will be.
Most of the remainder of the finale plays out in the kitchen, as it obviously did in the original. However, the idea of Amber and Richie's toxic fandom is a subtle reference to the 1990 movie Misery, which was adapted from the novel by Stephen King. The story follows famed author Paul Sheldon, who after flipping his car over during a snowstorm in the mountains, is rescued and nursed back to health by Annie Wilkes, an unhinged recluse who claims to be his #1 fan. He soon realizes that she's actually holding him prisoner in her house, and dissatisfied with his latest novel, forces him to write a new one in order to give its characters the ending she believes they deserve. This is obviously identical to the killer's motive in wanting the latest stab movie to get a do-over, but when Richie asks Sydney if she's seen it, she proclaims that she's not a fan of horror, which is a callback to her earlier sentiments from the original Scream. Similar to Gale getting shot in the ribs, Sydney is also stabbed by Amber in the same place where Jill had stabbed her in Scream 4, with a bloodlusting Amber even offering us another reference to Psycho when she imitates the infamous Bernard Herrmann score while miming a stabbing motion with her knife. Amber also drops name references to both Michael Myers and Jason Voorhees in respect to the Stab franchise not having the same killer to keep coming back, but she also compares Sydney to Jamie Lee Curtis by remarking on how you can't have a bona fide Halloween movie without its main star. And seeing as how there were 12 entries in that franchise upon the time of Scream 2022's release, I'll go ahead and add the other Halloween movies that featured Jamie Lee Curtis, which gives us Halloween H2O, Halloween Kills, and yes, even Halloween Resurrection, with her pitiful 3-minute cameo. Richie, on the other hand, gives us a reference to Stanley Kubrick's The Shining from 1980. Not directly, but actor Jack Quaid was said to have based the character's manic energy on Jack Torrance, which is especially evident in his ascent up the staircase and desperation while trying to locate Sam. Also, like Billy, Richie is ultimately killed in the exact same spot in the foyer, with Sam even firing off 3 cautionary gunshots just to be sure. For Amber's final hurrah, the makeup effects act as a reference once again to A Nightmare on Elm Street, where the design is meant to replicate Freddy Krueger's signature burnt look. However, this could also be a reference to the original Child's Play from 1988, as Amber bears a striking resemblance in both appearance and manner to a charred up Chucky doll during the climax of the movie. Amber's death also acts as a reference to the scrapped ending to Scream 3, in which Angelina was alternately revealed to be Roman's accomplice and the second Ghostface killer. In the final moments of the climax, after Roman is killed, it was actually supposed to be a fried up Angelina who ran into the room screaming before having her head blown off by Sydney. And even though Sydney doesn't get to add any more kills to her resume here, it's actually Tara who gets the final shot in, where she once again lets us know that she prefers the Babadook. The closing moments of the film obviously wrap up the character storylines in a very similar fashion to the original, with Chad and Mindy representing Dewey's reveal to still be alive as he's taken away from the house on a stretcher. In addition to that, the final shot of Sam and Tara holding hands could be a callback to Scream 3, in which a very different sibling relationship ended in a similar manner as Roman and Sydney clasped onto each other's hands in a fleeting moment of humanity they never got to share in either of their lifetimes. And finally, with the camera pulling back to reveal the entire Mocker farmhouse with police, paramedics, and reporters, the film ends on the exact same shot as it had with the very first movie. And there you have it, every horror movie reference that can be found in Scream 2022. If you want to see even more Scream related content, including all of the other horror movie reference videos from Screams 1 through 4, you can check them out in these playlists right over here. Until next time, I've been Zach Cherry, and I'll be right back.